our conversations is the notion of resilience, and be it resilience at the level of teams, which is what we're going to talk about today, or resilience at the level of companies, economies, or investments. We're really trying to synthesize how may we contribute to a more resilient Jordan, or any country that you happen to be in. My name is Resha Manna. I am an advisor for the United Nations Development Program in Jordan, leading the SDG Impact Initiative. And this is a flagship initiative of the UNDP, which aims to mobilize private sector capital towards inclusive and responsible businesses that are solving for some of the most pressing societal challenges, which is what makes them some of the most scalable investment opportunities. And we're really talking about education, healthcare, energy, water, infrastructure, climate change, AKA the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've been engaging the private sector since our launch a year ago, and really trying to move this conversation from this is what we do in terms of our CSR efforts to this is at the heart of our business models. And it influences and guides how we make business decisions and how we make business decisions. And really also have an understanding that we do so because it actually makes business sense. Because the simple reality is that businesses cannot flourish in ailing economies. And I truly believe that in light of the circumstances we're facing today, that this conversation is all the more pertinent. And it's actually a chance to transform businesses into ways to make them more resilient and to make them more future fit. We were actually meant to be holding an offline conference, a Prosper with Purpose conference in Amman, Jordan last week. But given most of us are homebound, we pivoted to a webinar format and contextualized this conversation in light of today's realities. I'm going to ask our speaker and moderator to turn on their cameras. We've invited a different person to moderate each session. And our first moderator is a dear friend, an ex-colleague from our Endeavor days, which is when we both got to know Sal, work with Sal and be inspired by him. And today, Tamer Salah is the managing director of Beyond Capital, which is an organization here in Jordan really supporting some of our most promising startups. And so with that, I'll let the conversation get started. Tamer, all yours.
Thank you, Rasha, for the kind intro, and thank you to UNDP for arranging the webinars and for giving me the opportunity to moderate this first very interesting conversation with you. I'd also like to thank all the participants for attending. I hope you enjoy the conversation and before we start, I'd like for this to be as engaging as possible. So please post your questions in the Q&A tab and upload any questions you like so that we can address them while we're having our discussion. Thanks, Sal, for being with us. Just a very quick brief about Salvador Giambanco. I think I said it right. He's a person with great experience in managing cultures in different industries and markets around the world. Expert in HR, having served Vice President of Human Resources and PayPal, and has led the HR operations at the Omidyar. His involvement with the Omidyar Network and the Global Innovation Fund today gives him great visibility also on the social entrepreneurship side and the investment landscape globally. I've had the privilege to talk to you, Sal, earlier this week. And what really I can say about this brief encounter is that I really felt that, you know, Sal is really connected to the real world. You would see as participants how passionate he is in making real positive change around the world. I think, you know, him being that will add a lot to our conversation. So without further ado, I'd like Sal to first welcome you virtually to Jordan. We would have loved for this to be at a real event, you know, at an actual event, physical one, but unfortunately for the current circumstances, which actually interestingly coincides with everyone needing to hear some of the points and advice from you. I'm really excited to have that conversation today. So to start with, Sal, I'd like to give you, the floor to tell us more about yourself and your experiences. More importantly, about you as a person, about Sal. Who is Sal? What your ideas are, what your vision is in general, before we get into the details.
Well, first of all, thank you, and I just want to point out our introduction today and how exciting was. If folks were paying attention to that introduction, our host for these sessions, she talked about some very important topics that are about the fundamental changing that's happening within capitalism itself, the importance of markets and the change that can happen there. And we're talking about this from Jordan, and we're talking about this from Amman, and how exciting is that? My regret, of course, is that I'm not there in person with you all, given the current circumstances. And it is good to be back with Tamer and my Endeavor colleagues. So first of all, thank you for that. We've shared journeys around the importance of markets and change. And if I were to say anything about myself, as many of you know, I don't like really talking about myself, but I would just say that I'm passionate about unleashing the potential in all of and everyone I meet, actually. I love being an executive coach. I love unpacking teams. I love working with entrepreneurs. My Endeavor colleagues know that I have a special definition for an entrepreneur who is someone who sees the impossible and makes it possible. Everyone tells them no, but they plow through and accomplish unbelievable things and changing their societies in the process. For today, I think one of the most important lessons that I would say is that is the interdisciplinary approach that I think is required in solving the challenges that we have today. One of the most important experiences I've ever had, aside from my corporate career and my career as a partner at the Media Network, is that I was invited at the beginning of the second Obama administration to participate in a nonpartisan symposium that lasted 2 years, which was around asking the question. So President Obama, after his election, asked the question, what are the leadership capabilities that are and competencies that are going to be required to solve the problems of the 21st century? And he posited that they'd be different than the leadership capabilities of the 20th century. And I think he was right. We spent 2 years answering that question. And in summary, I would say, and a big part of today is drawing upon that 2-year symposium, which is all about an interdisciplinary approach to solving all problems, using folks who have experience in government and education and NGOs, and then looking at different disciplines, history, theology, philosophy, the hard sciences, psychology, in addressing our problems. And I would argue that never in our history to date has an interdisciplinary, interconnected approach been more required.
Interesting. So I'm gonna get right to it. Given the interesting times that we're in today, it's very challenging, yet I'm sure it has a lot of opportunities to unveil. And I want to, delve deeper into your experience in that sense. I mean, you've been around the world. You've worked in our region here, in the MENA region. You've worked with refugees. You've worked in India. You've worked in the US and Europe and all around the world. And one specific experience that I want to point out is your time at PayPal. I mean, for those who don't know, which is something that I've learned recently, is that Sal was the 24th employee at PayPal and was handpicked by Elon Musk in 2000. And the year 2000, we've experienced the dot-com bubble, and yet PayPal emerged out of that dot-com bubble. And then you've left in end of 2008, beginning of 2009, which was another crisis there. It was a financial crisis. And in between, we've had different markets in different around the world, with the SARS issues, with other viruses, other similar activities that happened. How would that, first of all, tell us a little bit about this experience and how that changed, how businesses work, how Sal as a person changed the way you manage people, how you deal with people in the organization. I'm sure that those times were really rough, and we can learn something from them.
So on that question, it is interesting that I made the two most important career pivots during crisis. And I always like to point out that the Chinese symbol, in the written Chinese language, that the symbol for crisis is the same exact symbol as opportunity. And I think when you look at entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, who, extraordinary vision, see the opportunity in the midst of the challenge. And I believe that not to be gripped by fear, but to be gripped by compassion and values. So for example, when I left PayPal in 2008 to join the Omidyar network, we were in the midst of the financial crisis. And the Omidyar network was pivoting to pioneer ideas around using all forms of market-based capital to solve the problems of poverty. And I think in the dozen years since then, we've shown that real social change for the betterment of humanity requires all sectors to be working hand in hand and all peoples around the world to be working hand in hand. If there's anything that the virus shows us, is that the true interconnectedness of humanity is our reality. And I'm always drawn by the historical context of the place I'm working, and in this case, it's Jordan. And if we look at Jordan's deep historical roots, if we look at Jordan's theological history, its arc, then we recognize that there are innovations within the Jordanian spirit that I think will actually propel Jordan into the 21st century in this land of opportunity. So I would emphasize that in the midst of crisis, there is opportunity. And it's important that we cultivate as leaders the topic of this webinar, which is around how do we lead with our own resilience, and how do we become more innovative in the midst of crisis? That's really the question. And I'll pause there, but I think we'll probably dive into understanding what exactly is innovation and what exactly is resilience.
Actually, yeah, to that, business models kind of changed a little bit. Sal, I think if you can mute while, yeah, for the echo. Thank you guys for your comments there. So, if we can ask you, how your actual, you've led the HR there, and you've really grown the number of employees over time, at a time of crisis, where the company is feeling so much pressure, yet the human element is something that we cannot escape, and we see it. Our emotions control us every day. And as you pointed out, actually, in our brief discussion the other day, about the emotions in general, and how emotions set out the priorities of people, whether it was in business or it was in your personal life. And today we're facing that same challenge, for many reasons. So you're trying to get your company out there, you're trying to grow, and then everything collapses all of a sudden, quick changes, you have to adapt, you have to move forward. How would you, what kind of tips would you give entrepreneurs, to ride that wave, to think about innovation? As you said, this is a huge story, a huge topic to talk about, innovation in specific, yet, there are low-hanging fruit out there that you would have never seen without having that kind of crunch, having that kind of pressure on you. And that's what is known about entrepreneurs too. They go through that. What can you tell us there? How can we really, as leaders, as those leaders, as entrepreneurs of organizations, how can they take this through and move to the other side? Sorry, Sal, you have to.
That's really the heart of this webinar, right? Which is how do we as leaders take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of us in a crisis? And I'll point out that one of the reasons why I was always invited to these Endeavor conferences and speak globally to entrepreneurs is folks somehow think I have a magic wand, because of our first 240 employees in California at PayPal, which we all hired during this time of crisis, 40 of them went on to create their own companies. And as the sole head of HR and in the early days, the only recruiter, I somehow get the halo effect from that. But in reality, we had a leadership that was bold and that was seeing the opportunities in the crisis. And then we hired folks who were willing to take risks in the midst of a crisis, right? Most people in a crisis button down. They don't change jobs. But there are huge opportunities for the talent. And I think the cream of the talent, like any other crisis, they will be looking at those opportunities, both personally and professionally. And then you'll have business leaders looking at the opportunities of their own businesses. And so I think one of the most important aspects of innovation is, first of all, let's unpack what that means. Innovation is simply, so the etymology of innovation, it comes from the Latin root called innovare. And innovare in ancient Latin basically means to make changes. And so and also it means to do things differently. And I think the fundamental question, not just during a crisis, but on a regular basis, we all should be asking ourselves is, what am I in the future going to do differently? You know, Einstein said that the definition of insanity was doing the same thing over and over again and thinking that it was going to have a different outcome. And so how are we, and innovation is a fancy MBA word, I think, but in reality, all it is saying, what are the changes am I going to make in my immediate context to see the opportunities in my immediate context? One of the challenges of a global media is that the global media does not contextualize the situations in every country. So for example, using the virus, for example, the situation in Bangladesh is quite different than the situation in the United States, which is quite different than the situation in Italy, which is quite different than the situation in Nigeria. Each sets of leaders, the business leaders in these countries, the government leaders in these countries, are going to have to contextualize. Jordan, for example, Jordan probably follows the Western model given Jordan's income levels. And Jordan being a part of the global knowledge economy and its diversified, it's basically just, I would say, diversified excellence. But Jordan also has the challenges of millions of refugees in refugee camps that have to be really addressed. So the Jordanian question, again, may be one of the most complex questions. Jordan may be one of the most complex areas in the world for dealing with the virus. And Jordan is not going to find answers in one set or another, one set of rules or another. It's going to have to find its own way forward using information from these other places. Getting back to the leader themselves, and I might borrow again using my approach, which is always interdisciplinary, and a systems approach, which is looking at the entire system. If we look at, I would say, the person in the United States who is most like Nelson Mandela, he's our version of Nelson Mandela, is Bryan Stevenson, who is the founder of the Equal Justice Institute in Alabama. And he has a four-pronged personal approach, reflection approach, so to speak, that actually challenges us, or is a frame, his frame for having change, for making real change. Remember, that's what innovation is, making change. And he says there are four things that we need to do. One of them I've probably said 6 times already. Be proximate. What is in front of me? What is the contextualization in front of me? What are the advantages in front of me? And for the first, and for that, you got to turn off the media, because the media is not going to be addressing the opportunities that are right in front of an individual in their context. So being proximate is absolutely important. Secondly, change the narrative. The narrative that we see in the media, I think, tends to be one of anxiety. It tends to be one of fear. I always tell executives that I've worked with over the years, never make fear-based decisions. Fear-based decisions always lead to suboptimal outcomes. And so we have to change the narrative in our own heads. We can't be leaders if in our own heads we have a narrative of fear. Therefore, the antidote to fear, I think, is a number of things. I think it's gratitude. I think it's kindness. And most importantly, I think it's being hopeful. Being hopeful is actually one of the most important things we need to do in any leadership situation, not just a crisis. It's accentuated during a crisis. Finally, change involves a form of discomfort. Right, so change always involves some discomfort. When we're trying to lose weight, when we're trying to exercise. As a philosopher, my core training actually is in philosophy and ethics, and then tertiary in theology. But as a philosopher, the ancient Greeks had a very specific view of change, which would be, again, in our modern business world, the sense of innovation, which was in change. Something has to leave, something has to go, something new has to come in, a new idea, a new behavior, and it stays within the same. So that I am a being that is still Sal, but there are behaviors that I'm letting go, and there are behaviors that I'm taking on. And those behaviors lead to change. In summary, that is innovation. Be proximate. What's in front of me? Change the narrative. Ask yourself, what's going on inside my head? Who's forming my narrative? Be hopeful and be uncomfortable.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Actually, to the change point, you know, we're not only seeing change in businesses. I mean, our lives have been changed. Also, as you pointed out, you know, I had kids at home. You know, when we first talked, I had to run away outside and, you know, have the conversation in peace. And you know, and that change is also affecting people within their homes, within their houses, and companies should perhaps look at that as well. I mean, how do you think companies should, you know, nowadays, since everyone is forced to work from home, and perhaps we never did work from home before, or we're not used to it. I'm not used to, older people are not used to ordering online. Now today they're changing those habits, changing this kind of way. So how can we deal with that? I mean, on a corporate level, you know, we know that this is happening. The CEO knows how he's stressed at home and stressed in the office. How do leaders deal with that?
So, great question, and I'll start by saying, and as you know, I'll jump in. I always say I'm a pragmatic philosopher, so I'll start with the idea and then get very practical and very specific, or I say very technical. I think the world of ideas is kind of that strategic element, and then what you were just mentioning, like how do we do it, is a tactical element, and my value is only when we have technical approaches. But if I take one step back for a moment, how wonderful is it to recognize through the crisis that we are integrated people, that we're integrated in our families and in our careers, and in times in history in the past, that wasn't questioned. We've only had this separation since the Industrial Revolution. And you can still see, for example, the integration of family and work in the developing world. You know, if you drive through any bustling set of street entrepreneurs in Mumbai, for example, you'll see the multi-generations of family built with the kids running around and the grandparents in the back, working together in the entrepreneurial pursuit. And for those of us who have the ability to work from home, and I want to point out that, for example, we have 1.2 billion people on the planet who don't have that luxury of working from home. And so we have to address their particular needs. And I don't want to get off topic with that, but I just want to posit that we have that, which is very important. On the tactical side, a couple tactical things, right, for managers. And this is particularly important for my Middle Eastern managers that I love to work with. You know, so there are, for example, there are technology platforms. I'm having a meeting later today with the CEO and founder of a company called Transparent Business, which provides platforms precisely for employees who work from home. I'm on the board of a company in Calcutta, India called iMerit. It's a skills development, social purpose company. A majority of our folks work in artificial intelligence and digital services. A majority of our employees are women. And we are going through a massive transition right now where we went from 100% in office work to up to today, nearly 50% of our employees are contributing from home. This is a revolution. This has never been seen in the Indian tech sector, where you have this level of folks working from home. As you said, Jordan is on lockdown. I believe that these types of things that are happening, number one, at the very high level, great integration of family, self, and purpose in business. And at the practical level, it is forcing countries like Jordan into the 21st century in the digital age, where we're going to see far more work from home, the virus actually is making is actually a leveling playground in which every developing or emerging market country like Jordan is at the same is on the same playing field with any other country in terms of going into this future of work, going into a digital payments, digital economy, e-commerce, as you mentioned. But getting back to a couple of practical things on this idea of working from home that may be helpful. And again, a lot of this comes from my friends and folks that I work with, like the folks at Transparent Business. One of the most important things, and again, for my Middle Eastern managers who like to sometimes micromanage, I'll say, we have to be very careful about how, as managers, we micromanage. It's really hard to micromanage someone when they're not in front of you. And so, and micromanagement is actually not a form of management, it's actually a form of control. And so, and it's an extrinsic form of management as opposed to developing folks intrinsically to want to do a good job. And again, that could be a whole other webinar, just that one sentence I just said. But resist the urge to micromanage is very, very important. We have to be flexible. The flexibility required for individuals working from home, we have to be flexible to a point of almost infinite understanding of the conditions of our employees. And there's no better way of getting to know an employee than by talking to them in their living room, or by talking to them, as I did with you a few days ago, in the dark with the baby sleeping next to you, right? So, I mean, there's no better way to get to know you. And that intimacy can lead to unbelievable economic output and economic productivity. I always remind folks when you see me in live conferences that the number one reason why employees leave a company is because the number one reason is employees feel that the manager does not care about them as a person. The crisis today with people working from home, there is this amazing opportunity for every manager who's working from home to truly get to know their employees, to truly understand their anxieties, their fears, and to help them through them, and therefore get to and unleash the unbelievable potential in them. I think we all have to stay calm. And I'll come back to this over and over again. Seize the opportunity. There are opportunities here. Now, so that's a set of recommendations on the business side. Now we have this integration of home and family. So now let me give you some recommendations on the family side, right? You know, like, how do I manage my family, right? So that I'm an employee, right? I'm a manager, I'm working from home, and there are new challenges, right? I would say new opportunities for family integration, for family spending time together. I mean, think about that. The modern age, which is in many ways such an opposition to good family dynamics, is fostering upon us this ability to spend unbelievable amounts of time with the folks we love. And that's truly a gift. And I hope that this integration continues when the crisis is over. However, when you're with the same people you love and you're with them in a house 24/7, and you're both trying to work and you're both trying to put the kids through school online, there are some things to keep in mind. Number one, the elephant in the room is the concerns that everybody has about being in the room together, right? That's the elephant in the room that has to be addressed. Like, we have to address the fact that, okay, we're all in the room together, and we need to have new levels of communication and negotiation on how we're all going to do that. And we actually have to, I think, we have to make work now a part of our daily conversation about running the household. It's a very important concept that how we work now has to be a part of the conversation in the household with each other, because we're next to each other. So that's very practical. I would say tackle the situation of being at home with your loved ones like any challenge you would have in the office. You communicate with each other. I believe that the homes that will come out stronger from this are the homes that will have good forms of communication in that household. And we have a huge challenge where there is poor communication, and we're seeing this across Africa. We're seeing this in the slums. We're seeing this particularly and again, those folks who are often disproportionately affected by crisis, which is the global majority and the poor, that there are increases in reports of domestic abuse, etc. The way to diffuse that is by training all of our folks on having forms of communication with each other. So having communication is really important with each other. Avoid treating each other at home like colleagues in the office, right? The person at home is intentionally intense. They're intense, deep emotional relationships. That's not the type of relationship you have at the office. So remember that. Remember there's different dynamics in those relationships. And then try not to measure whose work is more important than the other, and try not to keep score on who's doing the most around the house, who's doing the most with the kids. And so there's very practical behaviors and new behaviors, right? We all have to change here. That's what innovation is. We're going to innovate. The whole thing about innovation is true innovation takes place at the personal level, at the level of the self. And then it goes into all around me. But the changes we have to make are different in the family than they are with managers at the office, but they're all related and we need to keep them all in mind.
Amazing, Sal. Actually, the communication part and the communication issue in general and the relationships, I want to focus on that a little bit. You know, in business, you know, as a CEO or as you know, any company, any manager, any leader, they have a certain relationship with their employees. Now, the communication issue is different, and the relationship is different amongst everyone. Today, this, as you said, has changed, and the relationship is now remote. Now we have to, you know, figure it out. However, let's be real here. You know, we are facing a huge. Most of the companies are facing a huge cash crunch, or you know, cash flow issues. Their business models are, you know, disrupted somehow. Their supply chains have been disrupted. You know, there are many challenges that entrepreneurs have to go through today. And usually, and what we've seen in the past, the first thing that, you know, people do and leaders do is that, you know, they want to turn their company to an efficient one, that is, or to try to trim off here and there so that they can extend their life for the next few months until things settle. You know, a slowdown would come potentially, probably. So the reality of it is that they go to the highest cost that they incur every month, which is mostly salaries. And this is where it really gets very tricky. You know, a good relationship with a leader with his employees or her employees would, you know, would be a difficult conversation. Yet someone, you know, it's different. How would that be communicated? Especially when I'm at home, I don't know what's going to happen. I know that my company is suffering. I love it, yet I don't know what to do or what's going to happen. So what would you advise us there?
So I'm going to address that last point first, which is around fear. Fear has to be addressed. The greatest fear that folks have in any crisis is the fear of the unknown. But remember, the fear of the unknown always exists. I mean, we never know what's going to happen in reality. And that's where being a person of hope, which is basically being a person of trust, which is required in leadership. Now, this is not Pollyanna leadership, but it requires a groundedness in the self, right? The most successful entrepreneurs, right? Again, going back to my definition that I started with, they see the impossible and make it possible. Because everyone around them is fear-based, and everyone around them says, you can't do that. Elon Musk was told 5 times that he can't be a pioneer in 5 different industries, and he created unicorns in 5 different industries. The only entrepreneur who has personally done 5 different successful startups in 5 different industries. Because each time he said, no, I know I can do this, and he did. On the fear base, we have to understand our own fears and what fears am I either directly or indirectly communicating to my people. And then we have to be reality and evidence-based in terms of what's actually happening. And I want to come back to the point I make over and over again, which is be proximate. Folks often ask me over the years, well, why don't you write down, Sal, your great ideas and stuff like that. I'm like, well, my ideas are only great if they're pertinent to a particular situation and a particular time and place. And so the idea that I might recommend to the sets of firms in your portfolio, or in fact, every idea that I would recommend to the companies in your portfolio would be different based on how they're proximate. You address, by the way, the number one issue that every company, the number one reason why firms fail is because of cash flow. So you have to pay attention to cash flow. And each firm has to take a look at what's going on in my cash flow. Now, again, it's hard in a webinar designed to be across many industries to address the specifics of particular industries, particularly like Jordan in a knowledge economy. But I want to say, again, be proximate. And then also I want to say that there are a number of companies. If you look at, for example, American companies, I didn't have a chance to look at the balance sheets of Jordanian companies in preparation for this. But last night I saw some data on the balance sheets of American companies. 25%, over 25% of America's companies have amazingly strong balance sheets right now. And so the folks with cash right now are going to have amazing opportunities, which for, I think, government leaders are going to pose particular challenges. Because there is the possibility of massive concentration of capital and a massive concentration of power in particular industries, in which the strong only get stronger and the weak get eliminated. And I think we have to make sure that we have the environments that will continue to support entrepreneurs, which are the main drivers of both innovation and employment in countries. And so those are my initial thoughts on your question. Again, be proximate. Ask yourself, what are the issues I am facing in my company? But more importantly, what are the opportunities that I'm facing at my company? And if I do have cash, right, and if I do have this ability, what are the opportunities? And am I going to be fear-based and hunker down and be an ostrich and put my head in the sand? Or am I going to seize the opportunities that are going to transform? There are going to be sets of entrepreneurs who a few years from now, we will be celebrating on the covers of business magazines, and they'll be writing lots of books about their stories.
So basically, I would summarize that culture that we built is based on compassion, communication, and opportunity, basically, within everyone in the organization. We have a few questions, actually, that are coming in from the audience. One is about a question that I asked earlier about work from home. And they're asking, should this be a temporary shift, or should this, is this going to be the norm? How should they work about it? Think about it going forward.
So again, it's a great question, and it really depends on on a particular company. But overall, if I were to make a general statement, and again, it's always conditioned contextually by a particular firm and their own opportunities and the need for collaboration, etc. I do believe that this is a very powerful trend. I think it's an important trend. The fewer cars we put on the streets. How about Delhi being able to see the sky, right? And the number of deaths from air pollution dropping. We can see fish in the waters outside Venice. There's some really amazing things by not putting cars on the roads and by not putting people by not putting people in seats in planes. One of the things that with the airline industry is, let's take a look and ask ourselves, do we really need that many planes flying around, right? I mean, and my sense is probably not. I think we're going to see major disruptions to the air travel industry personally. But on the future of work, I do think that anyone who has been a COO like myself knows that when you're running operations, that the number one cost driver of the reason why linking these two questions, the reason why CEOs and business leaders start targeting employees when there's cash flow crises is because they're not fixed costs. They're flexible costs. They're variable costs that they have more control over. But now is the time to be thinking about, okay, how do I really focus on my fixed costs, right? How do I really focus on that? WeWork has gotten a lot of press attention, right? For being so successful. They're actually operationally profitable. But they have so high fixed costs in their real estate that it drives them to, potentially oblivion, right? And so what's going on in those fixed costs? And we need to pay attention to that. I tell folks all the time, opening up a new office is always exponentially expensive. And I'm hoping that in working from home, it gives more tools to the business leaders to deploy capital in ways that don't automatically put the employee into the meat grinder, but rather puts all sorts of capital into the meat grinder such that you can keep the morale and you can keep your employee engaged. Because once you start laying off employees, then the only thing they're thinking about is what's happening to me next? What's happening to me next, right? And they can't hear anything other than I don't know what's going to happen to me next, and therefore their productivity goes out the window, and your costs. All of a sudden there's no. You ever wonder, like, you have these companies that have these first round of layoffs, and then all of a sudden they have a second round? Well, that's because they whatever cost savings they may have been getting in those little costs of letting an employee go is lost in all the productivity. And finally, always remember that the true cost of losing an employee is not their salary. It's not their costs. It's not those costs. It's the lost opportunity costs. It's all the training costs. It takes 6 months to a year for any employee to come up to speed and really produce. And so there are the Harvard Business School is, I think, estimated, if I can remember the stats, it's at least the value of a lost employee is at least 2 to 4x of their base salary. And so those are the true costs in losing top talent. And so we have to be really, really careful about losing top talent. And this is the working from home, I think, really provides business leaders with enormous flexibility here. And I would encourage them to be really thinking through the cost savings that create the opportunities by not having fixed costs buildings.
Great. Actually, I'm checking the questions. There are a couple of questions that are close to each other in a way. One that is targeting startups, another is targeting an existing business, and both are thinking on, as a startup or idea stage, how can you build a business plan when you really cannot? You're very uncertain about the future, and you really don't know what's on the other side. And that question actually touched upon resilience and being nimble at the organization, which I think you've touched upon many times, the resilience of an organization. And similarly, the other question is an existing company, and when they pivot and restructure, because of this pandemic, how to set those KPIs, how to set those standards and contribute towards the new direction. I mean, and that also links, I'm sorry, I don't mean to combine all the questions together, but there's also another question about the future. What do you think the future will hold? Since we're here talking about the unpredictable variable of the future post-corona, in many ways, how to set KPIs, how to be nimble, how to build resilience, and what do we expect? What should we expect?
All good questions. I took some notes down on them. Let's start with the startup world. Going back to PayPal. PayPal wasn't PayPal. PayPal was originally X.com. We were an online bank, and we lost a lot of money with that. We had the financial crisis. And one of the features of the X.com bank was that bank holders could email money to each other. And that became PayPal. And pivoting and maneuvering through that and looking for those opportunities in the midst of my markets that disappeared. In this case, online banking is not working. What do we do with this investor money? And he'll remain nameless, but I had one CEO that said, there's no business here, there's no market here, we should give the money back to our investors. Well, he was fired, and we then said, no, we're smart people, we're gonna figure this out. And the folks who figured it out are much smarter than I am. But people like David Sachs said, no, we're gonna actually figure this out. We're actually gonna move forward, and we pivoted. The other half of PayPal was a company called Confinity, whose original idea was to beam money with Palm Pilots. How many people on the call today have a Palm Pilot in their hand? How many people have Palm Pilots in their houses? They're now in museums, right? And so the pivoting is really important. That's why I come back to the top of the conversation on innovation. What changes am I going to make in myself? What narratives that I'm telling myself am I going to change so I can seize the opportunity? How uncomfortable can I get myself to seize those opportunities? Because change is all about discomfort. So that's on the crisis and the pivoting. One last thing on the startups. If the market, again, if you're in your startup, if the market looks good and you've raised your capital, right? I'm fortunate because the startup that I'm on the board of in Calcutta, India, we just closed a $20 million round of funding. We've got our funding and we're charging forward. We're not deviating from our business plan. What we are, though, changing, and again, a great leadership team there that's actually redefining the future of work, this type of work in India. That is true innovation. That is true change. So that's what we're doing at iMerit. So again, each company is different in terms of the challenges they're facing. For established companies, I get back to it. How do I put my fear aside and look at the opportunities, especially if I have cash? So the startups are interesting, right? Which is, do I need to pivot now in these changed times? Like, is my, again, the times have changed. So we need to do some analysis. We need to do some data. As chair of the Global Innovation Fund, and as one of the founding board members of the Innovation Fund, the reason why we exist and the reason why we attract capital is because, and I have to give a shout out to my fellow founding board members, Michael Kramer and Esther Duffalo, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics last year. And they won the Nobel Prize in Economics because the work of organizations like the GIF are around evidence. What does the evidence say that we should do? And how do we suspend fanciful narratives that are not grounded in reality in order to move things forward? So I always say, what is the evidence? What is the data? What is the science? Now, it may be unpleasant, and often it's unpleasant because it challenges my personal narrative. I'll get back to those personal aspects of change. Be proximate, change the narrative, be hopeful, be uncomfortable. Those are the elements of change. And unless I am, that's not going to happen. Now, this question on the future, and then I do want to come to resilience at some point, but the question on the future is, I always, and I'm on the cusp of both a philosopher and a theologian because I'm a Lonerganian. And for those of you who don't know, you can look him up on Wikipedia, but he was a 20th century Canadian philosopher who was both a philosopher and a theologian. And so I straddle the two. And, being a Lonerganian, we would say that the future doesn't yet exist. What exists is what's in front of me. And so rather than being looking at all sorts of future scenarios, I would be looking at what does the data suggest in the near term for me, in the short term for me. What a crisis does is focus on what do I need to do now? What changes do I need to make? And if I have an underlying faith or hope, and I would say a better translation of the word faith is trust. Trust that in an interconnected universe, in working with each other, we will get through this crisis. We have the opportunity to build better international institutions that bind us together such that we can weather future crises. I had the good fortune years ago of being exposed to the great work of Jeff Skoll at his foundation, and he had a global threats practice. Well, 10 years ago, we were actually looking at the top global threats, or he was looking at the top global threats to humanity. Those top three threats, were the top two threats, were around climate change and pandemics. So there have been people thinking about these issues for many, many years. I've had experience in pandemics as a former chaplain during the AIDS crisis, and I've also had firsthand experience with investments during the Ebola outbreak in 2015. And so again, we have to trust that we will get through this, we will learn from this, and I hope more importantly, build the institutions that bind us together, right? I come back to Jordan, and one of the reasons why I love Jordan is because it's an emerging economy. It has huge challenges with water shortages, with the water resource question, probably the biggest question for Jordan's future economic growth, in my opinion. But it has an amazing spirit. And what folks don't realize is that Jordan actually has a couple million Palestinian refugees. It has 1.5 million Syrian refugees. And it has opened its doors to the most vulnerable. And I actually think that that's actually pretty profound, that level of kindness should be integrated into the Jordanian spirit to see the opportunities that exist in this crisis. And so I'm less concerned about science fiction, which is often when people think about the future, it's often science fiction, and it's not about what's right in front of us.
Great. Actually, to the point, I also was talking to Sal for everyone else to know, and he quoted the Prophet Muhammad for dealing with pandemics, and it's very interesting to see that these things have been happening for a long time. Yet every time such a thing happens, we get surprised, we get that shock, we live in that fear, and then we move on. We unfortunately, for some reason, we're never really ready. And
by the way, on that point, that's a really important point, and particularly for, again, my primary audience here is my Jordanian entrepreneurs who I love to work with. And it's really one of the things I always kind of gently chastise y'all for is for not owning your talents, right? And not recognizing how talented you all are. And you're often in awe of these entrepreneurs in the West. But I want to talk about something incredibly innovative from the Prophet Muhammad. So I have his teachings on my desk here. And Muhammad actually had, 1,400 years ago, a whole set of recommendations for dealing with a pandemic. And I'm just going to read them. Number one was a travel ban. He said, and it was a double-sided travel ban. Muhammad said, if there's a pandemic, folks from the affected places should not come to our homes. And if you're visiting there, stay there until the pandemic lifts. Like, don't go home, right? If you're in a pandemic area. Two, distancing and isolation. And I want to point out that Muhammad talks about physical distancing, not social distancing. So we don't need social distancing. I mean, we need social connection more than we've ever needed social connection now. And I always like to point out that in Swahili, in East Africa, the Swahili language, there's no such concept of social distancing. It's only physical distancing, because it would be alien to folks living in East Africa to be thinking that you would have to somehow not be connected to the people you love. Three is hygiene, going back to Muhammad, which is one of the core pillars of Islam, of the practice of Islam itself. Hygiene, cleanliness is of the faith, right? I mean, really, really important. It's hygiene that's going to stop. This is the intervention, by the way, that's going to help stop the virus in Bangladesh, right? Because you have 160 million people living in an area the size of my home state here in Louisiana, right? Which is a really tiny place, where in Louisiana, we have maybe 6 or 7 million people, and Bangladesh has 165. Finally, we need to seek treatment. And I think this is really important. Muhammad, 1,400 years ago, Muhammad said that medical care should be free. So that was the whole point of the Bait ul-Mal, if I'm saying that correctly, on the government treasury. So really important things. And I want to point out that much like 1918, the current prescriptions for fighting the virus coming from the West are no different than Muhammad's prescriptions, and are no different than the prescriptions coming out of 1918. So there's nothing innovative in them. They're basic truths that have existed for 1,400 years.
Yeah, I mean, we should definitely learn from those and look back and just see how. I mean, I hope that we will be ready, and we will build that resilience after this pandemic, at least, and start thinking about it. More.
And again, I'm back to the future question. The way I look at the future is by looking at the past. And so I've spent a lot of time studying and reading about pandemics going back to some of the truly horrific pandemics, going back to the 6th century during the reign of Justinian. 40% of Europe was wiped out. The Black Death, 25% of Europe was wiped out. Even in my local New Orleans, we had yellow fever outbreaks every other year, most of the 19th century. And there's a lot to learn, both do's and not to do. But most of those learnings, I think, are focused personally in my own reflections, are on the self. How am I dealing with myself, and how am I dealing with my neighbor who might be suffering? And I think when I look at the history, and I'll bring this back to your question on the future, is when we look at, for example, the models that I've had an opportunity to look at, take a look at economic recovery following 1918 and economic recovery following Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in New Orleans, both of which are quite optimistic about the ability to bounce back. And I use that word deliberately, bounce back, or elasticity, Because, by the way, that's the definition of resilience, right? Resilience is a fancy word for saying I'm bouncing back. And so the question is, are we going to bounce back? And of course we're going to bounce back. And that's what the job of leaders is to remind us that we are going to bounce back. That's what resilience is. And if we look at, again, other disciplines, if we look at educational theory and educational teaching of young people, for example, in most theories of education and how to teach kids, we use things like the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, to teach kids not just about those subjects, but to teach kids about resilience. And a lot of educational theorists have posited seven, they call the 7 C's of resilience. And I'm just going to read what they are. Competence, when we notice what young people are doing right and give them the opportunities to do it more. Confidence, when we give young people the confidence they need to navigate. Connection, when we make connections with people and schools and our communities. Character, when we help our young people with a clear sense of what's right and what's wrong. Contribution, when we help young people to contribute to the well-being of others. Coping, when we help young people who possess a variety of healthy coping strategies and not turn to dangerous ones. And then control, helping young people understand the privileges they have, the respect that is earned through them, and the demonstrated responsibility that they have to others. And so those are, things that we globally, and I had the good fortune of being on the board of Teach for All for a number of years. And I worked, and I had exposure to some of the best educational theorists on the planet, including my comrade, who is the former Minister of Education in Zimbabwe, who is one of the most brilliant men I've ever worked with. And, this idea of, and again, taking like a country like Zimbabwe or South Africa, who are overcoming the resilience of the people that overcome things like apartheid. And we take a look at folks who are oppressed and come back and create these amazing futures, right? So that I want to link all of that together. I want to link innovation around change, resilience around bouncing back, and the future will be ours should we take those opportunities.
Great. Sal, we're almost out of time, actually. We have a minute left. However, I apologize for everyone who asked questions that we couldn't really address. One question that actually got our attention, which it's directed to you, and I'd love to close with. In your opinion, did this crisis expose what did this crisis expose in our reality as integrated species? I'm not sure if you heard it correctly, but I think you can see it. What, in your opinion, did this crisis expose in our reality as integrated species? I think, that philosophical side of you we can end there.
Well, I had the good fortune some years ago of working with Tibetans and working with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And in Tibetan, and really understanding and having an understanding of Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhist theology, whose grounded metaphysics is in this interconnectedness of humanity. And it's that we all get sick. And I'll talk about how in the past, if we're going to solve global problems, we have to recognize that we all have to work together. All nations have to work together. All peoples have to work together. That unless we work together, then we're going to have massive outbreaks of illness. We're going to have massive outbreaks of disproportionate impacts of any challenge anywhere in the world is a challenge to us all. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1937 was speaking, and he said, our job is not done when there is anyone suffering. That we all have a collective responsibility, not to the strongest in society, but to the weakest, because that defines who we are. And not just FDR, but Gandhi, the prophet, Jesus, the Buddha, all have said something similar.
Great. Sal, if I mean, we'd love to have, to hear any last tips, any last points that you want to tell those entrepreneurs, and last tips from you.
The most important thing I want to say again is be proximate, examine the narrative in your head, be hopeful, always be hopeful. There'll be some discomfort in our change, but remember, and take solace in your children. Think about how resilient children are. And whenever us adults get, a little, start doubting, go spend some time with some kids, because kids see, the kids don't see a no, they see a what if, or they ask a why. And it's that question why, and that's the question what if, that kids ask, that we must always keep alive in ourselves, which is so related to that sense of play. Let us never take ourselves too seriously, and let's always have a sense of play with each other.
That's great, Sal. This has been a pleasure. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I mean, this I could go on and on and on and just hear your thoughts on those different topics. Thanks again for your time. Really, I personally enjoyed this very much, and I'd like to thank UNDP for hosting this webinar as well. And thanks for the attendees for bearing with us and listening to this for the past hour.
Next time we got to do this in Jordan.
Definitely. We need to, and we'd love to have you in Jordan, and hoping that would be soon. Again, I would like to also remind everyone that this webinar series is going to continue thanks to UNDP. Thank you, guys, and hopefully we'll see you in the next webinars. And thanks again, Sal.
Thank you, everybody. It's always an honor to work with you all. You all inspire me so much and give me so much hope for the future. And again, special thanks to the UNDP. Again, our very platform here is a platform of interconnectedness, the United Nations.
Thanks. Thank you, Sal, again. Thanks, everyone. Rasha, if you want to say a word, a closing word. Okay, then I think that's it. Thanks again, everyone.
I think we're done. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.